Hello everybody. Today I'm going to show you a massacre that I witnessed 54 years ago on May 4th, 1970. I'm going to show you how millions of students and workers took the tragedy of those days and helped change history. We beat the most powerful ruling class that ever existed. And we're also going to discuss how we can do it again. The events leading to the Kent Massacre began in Vietnam, in a war that was waged throughout the 60s and into the 70s by both Democratic and Republican parties, from Eisenhower to Kennedy to Johnson and Nixon. Vietnam, like all imperialist wars, was waged regardless of who was sitting in the White House. Over 2 million Vietnamese, Cambodians, and Laotians were killed. Over 3,200,000 were wounded. Over 14 million people were turned into refugees. 300,000 children were orphaned. 15.5 million tons of bombs were dropped. Millions of gallons of poisons were dumped in the region, defoliating fully 10% of the land of Vietnam. 2.5 million U.S. soldiers of my generation were forced to serve in the war. Of those, over 60,000 were killed. Over 300,000 were wounded. Hundreds of billions of dollars were pumped into the death machine. Dollars which did not go to schools and medical care and social services. And over the years, we all came to hate the war. So on April 30, 1970, when President Richard Nixon announced the invasion of Cambodia, a major escalation of the war, it was met with widespread anger, and spontaneous student protests erupted all across the country. At Kent, a series of protests took place between May 1 and 3. Graduate students and Black United students both sponsored rallies, and there was weekend unrest in downtown Kent. Using the excuse of broken windows, the Ohio National Guard was called out and occupied the campus. Broken windows are a frequent concern of politicians, more so than war crimes. The Reserve Officer Training Corps, ROTC, was the U.S. military presence on campus, and we were demanding war machine off campus. On May 2, in an action that reeked of the work of agent provocateurs, the ROTC building, an old wooden structure scheduled for demolition, was torched. Nixon called the student protesters bums, and using the pretext of the ROTC building, Governor James Rhodes held an inflammatory press conference, complete with staged props to whip up hysteria against student protesters. He said groups like SDS and the Student Mobilization Committee, of which I was the chairman, were, quote, the worst kind of people in America. They have only one thing in mind, that is, to destroy higher education in Ohio. He went on to say, we're going to eradicate the problem. We're not going to treat the symptoms. Now, House Speaker Mike Johnson, echoing Rhodes, visits Columbia, condemning, quote, lawless agitators and radicals, end quote, and repeating overwrought and disproven fabrications to justify repression. He says, quote, if these threats are not stopped, there is an appropriate time for the National Guard. We have to bring order to these campuses, end quote. Well, at noon on Monday, May 4th, in protest of the escalation of the war and the military occupation of our campus, over 1,000 of us peacefully gathered on the Commons, a traditional free speech area. At the other side of the common were guardsmen, equipped with loaded assault weapons and fixed bayonets. They donned gas masks and sent out a jeep, and Adjutant General Robert Canterbury ordered us to disperse. When we refused to surrender our right to assemble, a line of troops began to march towards us. We retreated up Blanket Hill. They began a massive barrage of tear gas. And at that point, the demonstration was broken up. But the guardsmen continued to march over Blanket Hill to a practice field on the other side. There, General Del Corso of the Ohio National Guard threw rocks at students and called us pigs. They crouched and aimed at us. No one was near the guardsmen, as you can see here. Then they stood and began to walk back over the hill. But as they neared the top, without provocation, they turned and began to fire. There were 67 shots in 13 seconds, and it left the campus strewn with dead and wounded. This is close to the moment of the shooting. You can see the guard are in the upper right-hand far corner. You can barely see them. The students shot were from 71 to 495 feet away. The victims were unarmed and far from the troops. This famous photo is the body of Jeffrey Miller. That's me to the right with a white armband. I'm watching a student jump in a pool of Jeffrey Miller's blood. These are the murdered students: Allison Krause, Bill Schroeder, Jeffrey Miller, Sandy Schroyer. 9 others were wounded. Dean Kaler was paralyzed for life. The bloodshed was not over. Lost in the history of May 1970, 1 week later was the May 11th uprising in Augusta, Georgia, the largest urban uprising in the South during the Civil Rights era. When the burned and tortured body of an incarcerated 16-year-old mentally challenged black youth, Charles Oatman, was dumped by his jailers at a local hospital, it sparked a rebellion that left 6 black men dead, all shot in the back. Another 60 were wounded, mostly from cops rampaging with shotguns. These were black workers, and the history was buried. Then, 3 days later, on May 14th, 75 Mississippi State cops, armed with rifles, shotguns, and submachine guns, fired 460 rounds into a dormitory at protesting students at historically black Jackson State University. "I heard a sound like 100 freight trains," said one witness. They killed James Earl Green and Philip Lafayette Gibbs and left at least 12 wounded. The strike was already on, but the shootings at Kent led to an explosion of spontaneous demonstrations across the country. An emergency demonstration was called for D.C. the next Saturday by the New Mobilization Committee and the Student Mobilization Committee to End the War. I was asked to go to a press conference in Cleveland to speak on behalf of the Kent SMC. But a sweep of the town took place. The guy in the KSU t-shirt is my friend Tim Butts, a Vietnam vet and anti-war activist. As I was attempting to leave Kent, right-wing vigilantes stopped Tim and I in an isolated area of the town. One of the vigilantes had an M2 carbine pressed to my forehead, and I was expecting to be executed. Luckily, a police car showed up and arrested us. It remains the only time I've ever been glad to see a cop. When I was released a day later, I found that my off-campus room had been ransacked. I grabbed my stuff and left. The May 9th demonstration brought out over 100,000 protesters, an amazing feat for a few days. Somewhat out of my league, I found myself on the platform with Jane Fonda, Benjamin Spock, and Coretta Scott King, among others. I spoke and reported on the shootings. As we were meeting, the strike was spreading, eventually involving millions of students. Over 400 campuses were occupied and became centers of anti-war organizing. Almost all major universities were struck. The Student Mobilization Committee initiated the Committee of Kent State Massacre Witnesses. Back then, the way to get out the word of what was happening was to physically travel. And that's what we did, traveling to different cities and reporting on the massacre. This is Robbie Stamps, one of the wounded students, now deceased, along with me at a press conference at the Cleveland Peace Center. I traveled to a lot of campuses and had a chance to see the strike unfold. On campus after campus, students began to meet and discuss how to turn their universities into real institutions of learning, and how to build the movement to end the war. Massive democratic meetings went on day and night without cops and without problems. Those of us that were socialists were working to coalesce a nationally coordinated strike. We added our efforts to what hundreds of thousands of students were doing, shutting down business as usual and opening the campuses as what we called the anti-war university. The anti-war university we patterned the anti-war university on the actions of students in other countries, particularly in France. There, in May-June of 1968, students engaged in massive political struggles. They used the occupied universities to reach out and involve the working class in a massive general strike that nearly toppled the capitalist government of Charles de Gaulle. They called that strategy the Red University. We called ours the Anti-War University. The demonstrations of May 70 and the millions who were involved were the result of years of organizing. We began as a small minority in the 60s and built increasingly large mobilizations that began to reach out to the great mass of the American people. The Chicano community played an important role in this, mobilizing hundreds of thousands of working people. Combined with the ferment taking place in the African American and immigrant communities, the radicalization began to challenge fundamental political, social, and cultural beliefs. From the very beginning of the U.S. intervention, opposition began not only on the campus, but in working class communities and of critical importance within the Army itself. Throughout its duration, the anti-Vietnam War movement reached out to GIs to win them over to the anti-war movement. Even at Kent prior to the shootings, Alison Krauss placed a flower in the barrel of a rifle and told the guardsmen, "Flowers are better than bullets." It inspired a poem by the great poet Yevtushenko. The anti-war movement in the Army was mostly led by African American and Latino GIs that died and were affected disproportionately in the war. The National Student Strike provided support for the deepening of the anti-war movement within the armed forces. In one of the greatest and most inspiring chapters in the history of this country, active duty GIs self-organized a movement within the Army. This is a demonstration of active duty GIs outside Fort Hood in Killeen, Texas. I'm far right, next to David Zeiger, who went on to direct the film Sir No Sir, which documents this amazing movement. The anti-war movement spread deep into Southeast Asia. The army began to collapse in Vietnam. Soldiers refused order. Desertions were massive, over 500,000 desertions. Officers even began to be fragged or killed by their own men. Returning vets were an important component of the anti-war movement, telling the truth about what was happening. It was the determined resistance of the Vietnamese, despite the horrific punishment inflicted on them, and it was an inspiration to the world. The war makers were defeated by the combined power of the Vietnamese liberation struggle and the international anti-Vietnam War movement. Eventually, in April of 1975, the U.S. was forced to completely withdraw. We changed the American people's outlook on war forever. The days are gone when young people rush to enlist for imperialist wars. But then there was another kind of massacre that took place at Kent, a massacre of the truth. For 54 years, there's also been a cover-up of the events of May 4th. The man with the camera here is Terry Norman. Norman was a paid FBI informer at Kent. In this slide, a cop is taking a handgun from him, and a number of people claim he fired the gun to provide a justification for the shootings. But to this day, he has never been publicly questioned about FBI involvement in provoking the murders. There has never been a full accounting of the shootings, the role of the FBI, or other federal agencies. It's also important to understand that there was a militant mass anti-war movement and civil rights movement that led up to the events of May 4th. And for 54 years, the role of that movement has been suppressed. The demonstrations and moratoriums that mobilized thousands of KSU students remains mostly in the consciousness of those who participated. Socialists played a key role, beginning in the 1960s, in organizing educational forums and pickets, selling radical literature, sponsoring speakers, and introducing radical ideas onto the campus. The government and the KSU administration have attempted to sanitize and rewrite the real history as an unfortunate misunderstanding. But Alison Krauss was not just a victim. She was a protester, here collecting funds for the SMC. She took pride in her activism, and you can see it in her markings on a newspaper about the October 15th, 1969 national moratorium against the war, where thousands of KSU students marched. Allison proudly noted herself carrying the SMC banner at the front of the demonstration. And Sandy Scheuer, here shown with My Brother's Dog Heavy, helped build the demonstrations. Yet they are never identified as anti-war activists. To understand how much the ruling class wants to bury the truth, the attempt to rewrite history took an obscene new leap for the 50-year commemoration when Stephanie Dane Smith was named to head the year-long commemoration. This is her official faculty photo in front of the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency flag, her previous employer. Smith worked directly with Condoleezza Rice when Rice, Vice President Dick Cheney, and John Ashcroft carried out systematic torture on civilians at secret CIA locations, including waterboarding, sleep deprivation, and sexual assault. Smith's motto was, "Get there first and clean up your roadkill later." I guess that the KSU administration figured, who knows more about massacres than a CIA official? an organization responsible for enormous global bloodshed and hatred throughout the world. Smith's job was to cover up the role of the FBI in the shootings and rewrite the history of our movement. After public outrage, Smith was forced to step down, but the cover-up continues. It's carried out by her loyal supporters, including KSU President Todd Diacom, here shown making a mockery of youth culture. Smith and Diacom were able to find loyal allies in former members of the defunct liberal and ultra-left group Students for a Democratic Society, SDS. Notably, Roseanne Canfora, Alan Canfora, now deceased, and Tom Grace, who became loyal boosters of Kent State University. A cottage industry of so-called experts and survivors was established. These careerists have worked to remove the mass anti-war movement and promote a mythological history of Kent radicalism, a disservice to both the SDS activists of the time and the thousands of students who marched in anti-war demonstrations. The official 2020 KSU commemoration actually held a program honoring the ROTC instead of anti-war GIs. A group of over 1,000 labor officials, academics, and anti-war activists of several generations repudiated the official commemoration. The ruling class can use their media and institutions to rewrite history, but they can't erase the collective consciousness of millions of people. That collective consciousness is helping to determine the character of the emerging new anti-war movement today. Well, to protect their wealth, the U.S. ruling class has created a monstrous death machine. The U.S. naval fleet is larger than all other navies of the world combined, servicing over 395 major military bases that are tentacles around the globe. Over 8,000 strategic nuclear weapons and 22,000 tactical nuclear weapons exist. The U.S. ruling class has used nuclear weapons before, and they are willing to use them again. In this vast machine, Israel is a key partner. Israel was established as a military outpost of Western imperialism, a weaponized state to be used against the people of the Mideast, Africa, and Asia. And that is why the U.S. ruling class will fight so hard to maintain it. The destruction in Gaza means nothing to the ruling class. They have slaughtered millions with their wars, embargoes, and sanctions. The genocide in Gaza is not their concern. Today we face some serious challenges. We face the extinction of the species, either through being air-fried in nuclear annihilation or by being carbon-based slow roasted. The U.S. empire is dying. It's a wounded beast, an immoral and vicious foe. We are governed by immoral, vacuous, narcissist clowns and their toadies. But if you don't like them, our overlords will dress up some new ones for you, packaged in corporate boardrooms like the poison they dispense from vending machines. And so a lifelong Zionist militarist politician is reborn as a blustering socialist. A long-time pretend Indian Republican academic becomes a wide-eyed, outraged progressive. A former flunky to misogynist Ted Kennedy becomes a feisty young waitress. They're all supporting players in the same rotten theater designed to keep us from organizing on our own behalf. We have to stop this madness, and we can. But it won't happen through elections that are nothing but scripted theater. Genuine change comes from millions of us in the streets and in the workplace. In the decades since 1970, while the government has moved to the right, the working class has moved to the left. The largest anti-war march in history was not in the 60s or 70s. It was February 15th, 2003, before the invasion of Iraq. The largest class-conscious demonstration was not in the 1930s, but in 2006, when millions of immigrant workers ignored threats to their own safety to say, "We are workers, not criminals." The Occupy movement of 2011 was an unprecedented anti-capitalist revolt. And 2 years later, Black Lives Matter resurrected the power of the civil rights movement. Me Too and defense of reproductive rights has moved millions of women into action. It's here, in the streets, that we find the spirit of the martyrs of Kent, Augusta, and Jackson. In their brief lives, they were a part of a movement that changed history. We forced an end to the war and inspired great new changes. Today, the stakes are greater than in 1970, the very existence of humanity. And dealing with that is what the encampments and occupations represent. Students are not going to be turned around, no matter how fearsome you dress up the police thugs. Now, today we have a chance to do something even better than the 70s. The solutions to our problems are actually quite simple. You stop making nuclear submarines and make mass transportation and affordable housing. You stop making bombers, and then we can have free education and medical care. This country is awash in wealth, but all our resources are going to the super rich and the insatiable war machine that protects their profits. It's only our class consciousness that prevents us from doing away with this. We cede power to the ruling class. Just as under feudalism, the peasants gave power to the lord of the manor, until one day they didn't. The martyrs of Kent and Jackson were not socialists, but they did envision a better world. We need to place human needs before corporate profits. That's what socialists believe. Not socialism as a campaign jingle. Socialism as in abolish capitalism and put the capitalist parasites into productive labor. That's what groups like Workers' Voice are fighting for. Like every other visionary movement in history, we start small, just like the Civil Rights Movement and the Vietnam anti-war movement started small. The task before us is the greatest undertaking in human history. And to honor the martyrs of May 70 and countless others, we need to organize, educate, agitate, and create a new world of international solidarity.